Hello and welcome back to Sudoku Swami's Pencil and Paper Method. Today we're going to talk about one of the most commonly occurring and one of the most talked about patterns in Sudoku, X-wings. It's not too hard to find X-wings when you are using a computer or smartphone app that features full-blown automated and complete candidate lists. But in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to recognize them and use them in some unorthodox ways in pencil and paper puzzles. First, we're going to look at normal X-wings, and then I'm going to show you a couple of unusual variations that I'm sure you will find to be very helpful. So I hope you will all watch this whole tutorial before skipping ahead to the puzzle that we will solve at the end of this video. Okay? Great. Just like we did in the last lesson on locked candidates, I will first explain what an X-wing is and how it works by using complete candidate lists. This will help you better understand how we will apply them to pencil and paper puzzles. So let's get right to it. If you remember from Lesson 5 on terminology, when you have exactly two remaining instances of any same-digit candidate within at least one house, we call this a conjugate pair. In a conjugate pair, we know that one of the two candidates must be true and the other must be false. Knowing this allows us to make other types of deductions throughout the puzzle. And when you have two conjugate pairs on the same candidate that lie in either two rows or two columns, and they line up in such a way as to form a rectangle or a perfect square, we call this an X-wing. And when this happens, we will immediately know that one diagonal pair of those four candidates will turn out to be true, and the other diagonal pair will turn out to be false, even though we don't yet know which is which. Now here in this puzzle, there are only two candidate 1s in row 2, and there are only two candidate 1s in row 4. And those four candidates line up such that they also lie in columns 6 and 9, forming a rectangle. This is an X-wing. An X-wing will always have four same-digit candidates that lie in exactly two rows and two columns. But the stipulation is that the candidates must be conjugate pairs in both the rows, or they must be conjugate pairs in both the columns. In this puzzle, the candidate 1s are conjugate pairs in the two rows, row 2 and row 4. In each of those rows, we know that one of the two candidate 1s must be true and the other must be false. And the only way this can work out is if one diagonal pair of those 1s is true and the other diagonal pair is false. In other words, either these two will be true and these two will be false, or these two will be true and these two will be false. That's the only way it can be. And this relationship kind of forms an X like you see here, hence the name X-wing. So regardless of which diagonal pair turns out to be true, one of the two blue cells in column 6 is going to be solved for 1, and one of the two blue cells in column 9 is going to be solved for 1, right? So this means that any other candidate 1 in those two columns outside the four X-wing cells has to be false and can be eliminated. So here in this puzzle, these 5 candidate 1s are false and can be eliminated. This is how an X-wing works. And of course, the set of two conjugate pairs can lie in two columns like this. Here in this puzzle, these are the only two candidate 8s in column 1. They are a conjugate pair. One must be true and one must be false. And likewise, these are the only two candidate 8s in column 6. They are also a conjugate pair. One of them must be true and one of them must be false. And these four cells line up to form a rectangle because they lie in exactly two rows and two columns. And so because we know that one diagonal pair of those 8s must be true, either like this or like this, we can eliminate any other candidate 8 that lies in rows 3 and 9 outside of the four X-wing cells. So these 6 candidate 8s cannot be true and can be eliminated as false, okay? But in a pencil and paper puzzle, an X-wing is going to look something like this. Because of the 4's already placed in row 2 and in row 3, and because of these other numbers in block 1, we know that a 4 must go into one of those two cells. That is a conjugate pair. One of them must be true, and one of them must be false, so we can enter it just like that. And down here, because of the 4's in row 8, row 9, and column 1, we know that a 4 must go into one of those two cells. That is also a conjugate pair. One must be true and one must be false, so we can enter it just like that. So what we will know from this is that one diagonal pair of the 4's in those blue cells will be true, and the other diagonal pair will be false. Like this, or like this. And what this means is that as soon as we eliminate or solve any one of those 4 candidate 4's, we will know the true-false value of the other 3. Like if we discover this one up here in row 1, column 3 is true, then we will know that these two are false, and that this one must be the other true one. Okay? Or if we discover that this one down here in row 7, column 2 is false, then we know this one also must be false, and that these two will be the true ones. Now, just like with locked candidates, the logic for X-wings works backwards in a pencil and paper puzzle from the way it works on a smartphone or computer app. When you can see and analyze all the candidates, first you find the X-wing, and then you say because of the X-wing, these other candidates must be false. But in a pencil and paper puzzle, first you say because these candidates cannot exist in these particular cells, then there must be conjugate pairs in these other cells, which form an X-wing. So you see, the logic is backwards. It is deductive reasoning either way, but with a computer app, the logic goes in one direction, and with a pencil and paper puzzle, it goes in the exact opposite direction. But now I'm going to show you some twists on all of this. There are a few variations on X-wings that we can use in pencil and paper puzzles that we don't normally pay attention to when solving puzzles on a computer app. A standard X-wing is always going to be in the shape of a rectangle or a perfect square with each of the 4 cells as one of the 4 corners like you see here. But consider this configuration. Because of the 4 in row 3 and the 4 in column 1, and because of the 8 and the 3 in block 1, we know that one of these two blue cells must be a 4. Even though they are on a diagonal within that block, they are still a conjugate pair. One must be true and one must be false. And down here, it's the same as it was in the last diagram. One of these two cells must be a 4. So even though these two candidate 4's up in block 1 are on a diagonal within that block, the fact remains that either these two will be true and these two will be false, or the other way around. These two will be true and these two will be false. It's the only way it can be. So we can still benefit from this even when we have a diagonal conjugate pair. And whenever this happens, we're going to call this a crooked X-wing, okay? Now this is my own term, but I think it's a fairly descriptive name of what's going on here. And a crooked X-wing can look like this, or it can look like this, with both conjugate pairs on a diagonal. Or it can look like this in a horizontal chute. You get the idea. So just like a regular X-wing, with a crooked X-wing, as soon as we determine the true-false value of any one of the 4 candidates, we will immediately know the true-false value of the other 3. Capiche? And of course, this can only happen in 2 blocks within a single horizontal or vertical chute, because it would be impossible to have a conjugate pair on a diagonal if the 2 candidates were situated like this. These 2 9s up here are not a conjugate pair. The 2 candidates in a conjugate pair must always see each other, so they must always be in the same house, and if they are on a diagonal, they must be within the same block. So a crooked X-wing is always going to be in only 2 blocks and in only 1 chute, like this. Alright, so that is a crooked X-wing. The other variation looks like this. Let's say we have a conjugate pair of 3's up here in block 2 and another conjugate pair of 3's down here in block 5, and they line up like this, such that they do not form a normal rectangular X-wing or a crooked X-wing. The two candidate 3s in column 6, they line up and can see each other. Let's call these the connecting candidates. But the two candidate 3s in column 4 and column 5 do not line up. They are not connected. They are offset and do not see each other. So if we discover that either one of these connected candidates is true, we will know the true-false value of the other candidate 3s in the blue cells, just like with a crooked X-wing. And we will get the exact same results if we discover that either of the offset candidate 3s is false. Because if either of them is false, that will make one of the connected candidate 3s in column 6 true. But, and this is a big but, if we discover that either of the offset candidate 3s are true, or if we discover that either of the connected candidate 3s in column 6 is false, then we will only know the true-false value of its partner in that particular conjugate pair, but it won't tell us anything about the other conjugate pair. Like if we find out that this 3 is false, all we're going to know is that this 3 is true, but we won't know anything about these two 3s down here in block 5. And of course, this is going to work the same way if one or both of the conjugate pairs is on a diagonal like this. As long as one candidate from each pair can see a candidate from the other pair, the two conjugate pairs will be related. An easy way to remember this is to just focus on the two candidates that can see each other, i.e. the ones from each conjugate pair that lie in the same row or the same column. Like here in this diagram, that would be these two candidate 5s. If either of these candidates is true, then you will know the true-false value of the other 3. But if either of them is false, then you will only know that its partner in that conjugate pair is true. Like if this candidate 5 were false, you would only know that this 5 is true, but you wouldn't know anything about these two 5s down here. Now I was tempted to call this configuration an offset X-wing, but that's not really what it is. So let's just call it related conjugate pairs, for lack of anything better, okay? All right, now let's solve today's puzzle. We've got 23 givens, so it's not going to be a quick walk in the park. And as you can see, this is one of those symmetrical looking puzzles. These cells mimic these cells, and these cells mimic these cells, and these cells mimic these cells, kind of like a mirror image, and these cells mimic these cells. And then we have a lone 6 smack in the middle of the central block. I don't know, but I kind of like puzzles like this. I'm not sure if they are designed by humans or by computers, but there's a kind of beauty to it. I certainly couldn't do it. I solve puzzles. I don't create them. Ha ha. Now I suggest that you stop the video and try to solve this puzzle on your own before watching this demonstration, but that's entirely up to you. My system of entering candidates is fully described in lesson number 6 of this series, but in a nutshell, we will be entering conjugate pairs, naked pairs, and 2 by 2 by 2 triples. And if a candidate can appear 3 or more times in any particular house, we will just leave it blank, at least temporarily. Got it? All right, here we go. So let's just cycle through the numbers and see what happens. So we've got a 1 up here in column 6 and a 1 over here in column 4, so we can put a 1 into these two cells. That is a conjugate pair. Now let's go to 2. Because of this 2 in column 2 and this one in row 4, we can put a conjugate pair of 2s into these two cells. And because they rule column 1 now, one of them must be true, and this 2 rules column 2, we know that we can put a conjugate pair of 2s into those two cells. And now, because of this 2 in column 7 and this one in row 8, we can put 2s into these two cells, and because one of them has to be true, this one cannot be true. That one gets zapped, and we can enter this one because that was a conjugate pair. So now let's move to the 3s. There's only one 3 in the whole puzzle, and there's not much we can do with that, so let's move to the 4s. And with the 4s, we've got one in row 2 and in row 3, so we can put a 4 into these two cells. And now because of this one in column 1 and this one in column 3 and this one in row 7, we know we can enter a 4 into this cell. And likewise, because of this 4 and this 4, we can enter a 4 into that cell. And now we can crosshatch a 4 into this cell right here in row 8 because of this 4 in row 7 and this one in row 9, and that's going to negate this 4. So you can erase this 4 and enter these two 4s. Now we have 8 4s placed, and whenever that happens, we know that there's always only one cell left for that 9th instance of that candidate, and it's going to be right here in row 4, column 4. And now the 4s are done. So let's move to the 5s, and we've got a 5 in row 8 and a 5 in row 9, so that means we can put a conjugate pair of 5s into those two cells. And because of this 5 here in column 8 all by itself, we can put a conjugate pair of 5s into these two cells. We could also put a 7 in there, but we'll get to that later. So now these 5s rule column 9, and this one rules column 8, so we can put 5s into these two cells. And then because of this 5 in column 6 and this one in row 6, we can put a conjugate pair of 5s on a diagonal into those two cells, so that makes a crooked X-wing. So as soon as we solve or eliminate any one of those 4 candidate 5s, we will know the true-false value of the other 3. And so now let's move to the 6s. And because we've got a 6 in row 5 and a 6 in row 6, we can put 6s into these two cells. And because of this 6 in column 5 all by itself, we can put 6s into these two cells. One of them has to be true. And now because they rule row 3 and this one rules column 9, we can put a conjugate pair of 6s into these two cells. And now because they rule row 1 and these two 6s rule row 3, we can put a conjugate pair of 6s into these two cells, and now we have a set of related conjugate pairs. These two 6s in column 3 are connected. So as soon as we figure out one of these is true, we are going to know the true-false value of the other 3. But if we find out that one of these offset 6s is true, then we will only know the value of its partner. Now notice that this cell and this cell, even though they have 2 candidates each in them, they are not bi-value cells. We know that one of these cells must be a 5 and one of these cells must be a 6, and we know that one of these cells must be a 5 and one of these cells must be a 1, but that doesn't stop a 3, 8, or 9 from being in this cell, and that doesn't stop a 1 or a 7 from being in this cell. So you have to remember that those are not bi-value cells. When you have a naked pair, then those are bi-value cells. Those cells can only be solved for those candidates. But here, this is not the case. So let's keep going and get rid of that. So now let's move to the 7s. We've got a 7 in column 1 and a 7 in column 3, so that leaves only one cell left, and we can place that 7. We've got a 7 in row 7 and a 7 in row 8, so that means we can put a conjugate pair into these two cells. And like we noticed before, this 7 rules column 8, so we know a 7 must go into one of these two cells, but there's a 7 over here in row 4, so it can't go here, it must go there. We can place that 7, that means this 5 is false, and you can erase it. And now we've solved our crooked X-wing. This is going to be true, and this one has to be false, and we can enter those 3 numbers. And so now, because we have a 7 in column 8 and column 9, we know a 7 must go into one of these cells, but we've got a 7 in row 1 now. So the 7's got to go there, which means this cannot be a 5, which means this is a 5, so you can erase that 6, and now you can solve these 3 numbers. Okay? And now with this 5 in row 1 and this 5 in column 3, we know a 5 must go into that cell, and so now we're going to solve this related conjugate pair because this cannot be a 6, so this 6 must be true, and this is one of the connected 6s. So that means this one is true and this one is false. Now if this 5 is true, like we know it is, this 5 down here has to be false, and so we can enter that as the other half of that conjugate pair, and we can enter all of these numbers as well. And now there are only 2 empty cells in column 2, so they must be a naked pair of 1 and 3. Those are the only 2 numbers left in that column. And so those are bi-value cells. One of those cells has to be a 1, and the other has to be a 3. And this also creates a set of related conjugate pairs with these 1s over here in column 5. These 2 1s in row 6 can see each other, so they're connected. Just like these 6s were a few minutes ago up here in block 1 and block 4. So now we have 3 empty cells in block 1, and they must be 1, 3, and 9, right? But we've got a 3 right here in row 1, so neither of these cells can be a 3. So this is what we call a reduced triple. This has to be the 3, and these cells must be a naked pair of 1 and 9. So now it looks like we have 8 instances of 5, which means the last 5 has got to go in that cell right there. And it looks like we can put a 7 into this cell because of this 7 in row 1 and this 7 in row 3. So that's got to be a 7. But we've got a conjugate pair on 7s down here, so you can erase that 7 and enter those 2 7s. And now we have 8 instances of 7, and there's only 1 left, and it's got to go right there. And now if we look at row 2, we've only got 1 cell left, so that's a full house, and you can put a 3 into that cell. And we've got 2 cells left in row 1 because the 1 and the 9 are accounted for up here in block 1. So these 2 empty cells have to be 2 and 8, and because there's an 8 right here, this has to be the 2, and this has to be the 8. But notice we've got a conjugate pair down here in block 9, so this 2 is going to be true, which means you can erase that 2, and you can solve those 2's, and you can solve that 8. And now because of this 2 in row 4 and this 2 in column 6, we can put a conjugate pair of 2's into these 2 cells, and now one of those has to be true, so you can erase that 2 and enter that 2. And now we have another naked pair in block 4. These must be 8 and 9 and 8 and 9. And now we have a 2 by 2 by 2 triple here in column 3. Notice that these 3 cells have to be 1, 8, and 9, and because there's an 8 in block 1, this can only be 1 and 9. And because one of these cells has to be a 1, this has to be 8 or 9. And because there's a 9 in block 7 here, this cell has to be either a 1 or an 8. Now once we solve any one of those 3 cells in column 3, we're going to know the value of the other 2 cells. Okay? So now there are only 2 empty cells left in block 2, and they must be 2 and 6. But because we have a 2 down here in column 6, this has to be the 2. So you can erase that 6, and this must be a 6. And now this 2 negates this 2, so this 2 must be true, and you can erase that 1. And we're going to solve this 1 up here, but that's going to have no effect on these 2 1s over here, and all we will know is this 1 down here was going to be false. So you can enter that 1, that 2, that 6, and that 2. And then up here in row 1, again, we've got 2 empty cells, and they have to be 1 and 9 and 1 and 9. But notice, one of these 3 cells in block 6 has to be a 1, right? Because there's no 1 in these 2 columns. So there has to be a 1 in one of these 3 cells. So this cannot be a 1, which means this is a 9, and that cannot be a 9. So you can enter those 2 numbers. And now we have 2 empty cells in column 4, and they have to be 8 and 6. But there's a 6 here, so this has to be 8, and this has to be the 6. But if this is an 8, that's going to negate that 8. And if this is a 9, that can't be a 9. And if this is a 1, that can't be a 1. And if this is a 9, that can't be a 9. And if this is an 8, this cannot be an 8. And you can enter all of these numbers. Okay? And now these 2 cells in column 6 have to be 3 and 9. And because there's a 9 right here in row 5, this has to be the 3. And this has to be the 9. So if this is a 3, that negates this 3, and if this is a 1, this cannot be a 1, and this has to be a 3, so we can solve those cells. And now there's only 1 cell left in column 6. That's a full house. That's got to be an 8, and these have to be 3 and 9, 3 and 9, and these 2 cells in column 9 have to be 8 and 9, and 8 and 9, but because there's a 9 here in row 8, this has to be the 8, and this has to be the 9. So this 9 will negate that 9, and this 3 will negate that 3, and you can solve these cells. So now these 3 cells in block 6, you can look at them as either a naked triple or a full house in row 4, 5, and 6, which means these cells have to be 3, and this one has to be an 8, and this one has to be a 1. And now these 3 cells have to be 1, 3, and 6, and because there's a 1 and a 3 in row 9, this has to be the 6. And so this has to be the 3, and this has to be the 1. And so now we've got a naked triple down here in block 7, so these have to be 3, 6, and 8, and the puzzle is solved. Unfortunately, there were no normal rectangular X-wings in that puzzle, but at least we saw a crooked X-wing and a couple of related conjugate pairs. Okay, that's going to do it for today. If you enjoyed this video, please click the red subscribe button, the thumbs up icon, and be sure to click the little bell icon if you would like to be notified of new video uploads. And don't forget, if anyone has a puzzle from a newspaper, a magazine, a puzzle book, or whatever that you would like to see me solve in a future video, please send it to me at sudokuswami@gmail.com, okay? In the next lesson, before we solve our puzzle, there will be a short and sweet refresher tutorial on naked pairs, and I hope to see you then. In the meantime, be well and be happy.